Hello and welcome to Get Focused with Bill Kay and Gina Fay. Hi, Gina. How are you today?
I just told you how I was. We were talking before
I
we
know you
started
told me.
recording.
Okay, from all of our listeners.
Oh,
Hi,
the
Gina. How are
listeners,
you today?
I'm wonderful, Bill. Thank you very much for asking. How are you?
I'm doing well. Just
Good.
surviving our big frost here in San Diego. We're at 60 degrees.
Ah, ah, too cold
That's
for
what
me.
happens.
Too cold for me.
It's pretty fascinating though because so with cycling and I go out about 4:35 a.m.
You must be freezing in the
Well,
mornings.
yeah, because there's no sun, so it's definitely cold, and it's interesting because I ride out to the I don't know if you remember the lighthouse on the
No,
top of the hill. Okay, so there's a lot of hills and valleys on the way
right.
there.
Oh, right,
So
right.
the difference in the temperature from going in and out of those, it's pretty interesting. But
I
so
can.
one of the things I wanted to talk about, I know we talked about this briefly right before we came on here, was an article that you had posted on Facebook
Yep,
about the inner child, and
yep,
I wanted to discuss that because I think it's something that we hear a lot about, but
yep.
people don't
Don't really
really,
understand it.
yeah,
Yeah.
mean what the meaning is.
I work a lot with people on inner child work. And initially, it seems kind of hokey to some people. They can't really relate to it. But once people get into it, I find it, they respond very, very positively. And this article, even though the title is a little bit misleading, and we can put a link to this article at the end of our, at
Yeah, in the
our
show notes, absolutely.
show notes, but it kind of explains a little bit why this work is so important. So what I thought, what we talked about is I'm going to just read like a couple of paragraphs, and
Yes,
then we
please.
can kind of jump off from there, as we have a tendency to do.
Not us.
No, I know. All right. So, okay, I'm just going to start from the top and I'll stop when it feels appropriate, but it sums it up pretty well. The concept of healing our inner child is one that has been discussed in self help therapy and spirituality circles alike. While many people may brush off the concept of healing our inner child as just another kooky self help tactic for people that can't seem to get over their past or their childhood, those more well versed in an awakening journey know differently. The process of healing our inner child is actually the process into wholeness, unity consciousness, and complete integration of our ego. What this means is that any and everyone who is going through a spiritual awakening process will have to go through this aspect of it at some point or another. The healing of our inner child is not reserved only for those who have had an abusive or traumatic past. It is the process of first facing and then embracing our most vulnerable and deep rooted aspects that we often try to hide from the world and sometimes even from our own selves. And just one more paragraph until our most vulnerable parts feel accepted and loved, we will find ourselves in situation after situation that is attempting to get us to not only be honest with ourselves about these deep vulnerabilities, but also trying to guide us into the deepest surrender, which is when our personal will merges with divine will. One more. The fact of the matter is, the fact of the matter is, our inner child is actually the one running the show. It is the part of us that feels everything in our heart, which is our direct connection with the divine. So what we have to do is help it feel safe. Help because oftentimes growing up, that part of us did not feel safe for various reasons. It's not about a blame game, but it's about having to adapt in kind of dysfunctional ways sometimes to the environment that we found ourselves in. And
I Yeah, I definitely can relate to this. I know we discussed this in a previous episode about feeling that, or I have the thought that I'm not the adult in the room sometimes, right? And how you could be in a room with fellow workers or anybody, just a company, everybody's in the same age group and whatnot, and not feeling like you're the child in the room with all the
you
adults.
you feel like you're the child in the room sometimes.
Yeah.
Yeah, I have several clients who tell me that.
So I
They
can understand how like the insecurities of childhood still being represented even in adulthood.
Well, it's not so much insecurities, it's the incorrect stories we make up. We tell ourselves to explain our situation as children. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, but that isn't along those same lines.
No, it's the that suggests that the insecurities are within us. And in fact, the insecurities are outside of us, but we tend to take responsibility for them when we're children because
Ah, okay.
yeah, there's a huge difference. So, what I like to talk about to clarify this is when we're children, we know how vulnerable we are. We know how dependent we are on our adults for our very survival, right?
Right. Not just for food and shelter, but
Everything,
everything else.
everything. Without them, we die. So, we are not inclined as children, if the environment isn't totally amenable to us, what we need, we're not, as children, going to recognize that that's because of the failings of our parents. We're going to assume that it's because we're not right. There's something not right about us. Does that
Right. We take the blame.
We take the blame because it's safer. It's no child is going to be able to say, ah, I get it. My parent is messed up. That's why they can't love me the way I'd like them to. That's why they can't listen to me the way I feel like I need to be listened to, or see me to make me feel really seen. They're going to say, I must be messed up. Because if they acknowledge that there's something not quite right with one of their parents, where does that leave them?
Right. But I also, as a child, you everything you see from your parents or the adults in our lives, you see it as that's the way it's supposed to be,
No,
whether it's right
don't.
or wrong. No.
No, you don't. No, you don't. Because we all have our hearts. We're all born with a sense of what our birthright is. And our
Okay.
sense of our birthright is to be seen, to be valued, to be nurtured, to be cared for, to be loved. And that doesn't happen sometimes in various combinations. We don't, initially, we tell ourselves, well, that's just how it is. But there's another little voice that goes on inside of us, or a feeling in our bodies when we're lying in bed crying and our parents don't come to us. There's a part of us that says, this is just messed up. There's just something wrong here. So let me be funnier. Let me see if I can be smarter in school. Let me see if I can't be quieter. Let me try to adjust. There must be something wrong with me. I'm crying
Okay.
and they're not coming. You can't afford to say there must be something wrong with them, because if something's wrong with your caregivers and you're so dependent on them, where does that leave you? Up shit creek without the paddle, really.
Yeah. Right.
Right? So you're lying in bed crying, your parents never come, or they come and they hit you, or they come and they shame you, and or they come and they tell you to shut up. There's a part of you that knows full well that that's not normal. No matter how hard you try to persuade yourself that that's normal, there's a part of you that knows it isn't normal. But then what you do as a child is you proceed from the assumption that you can correct it. If you can be whatever, fill in the blank, as I said, smarter,
Right.
prettier, whatever, then you will be loved. And then when you're crying, your parent or parents will come and soothe you, which is what you need. And you don't have the words to say, I want to be soothed, but you have the ability to cry and notify them that things aren't right with you.
So that's where the stories that we tell ourselves to try and um, uh, become better in our minds, right? And think that acceptance. We've talked about this. That's where that need or that desire to, oh, I have to get straight A's or I have
Yeah.
to.
Yeah.
Um,
Whatever you pick up from the messages from them about what they value. So if they're always giving you the message that children should be seen but not heard, you may come to the conclusion that I better be quieter. Maybe if I was quieter, they'd like me. Or if you get from your father that he really values athleticism and kids who do well in sports, you may decide, well, maybe if I do really really well in sports, he'll take notice of me. He'll pay attention to me.
Okay, so are there different levels of this? Because obviously, I know I didn't grow up in a household that, uh, we were middle class household. There wasn't abuse or a physical or verbal abuse, but obviously there's different degrees of this, correct?
Absolutely. There are, I mean, I have that same approach before I really got aware of the work that has to be done, or it doesn't have to be done, but can be done in therapy,
Right.
and self-aware, the value of self-awareness. I used to think, yeah, I didn't have an abusive childhood. Nobody put cigarettes out on my back. Nobody raped me, as far as I know. So it was good, it was good. But then I came to realize, number one, that as I done the work more with other people and helped them recognize what was missing for them in their childhoods, I've come to understand that some of us are born more resilient and some of us are born more vulnerable. So you can have two kids in the same household, being dealt with by the same two parents, and one of them ends up, addicted to crack because they were so vulnerable to what they understood they were being told about themselves by the parents' treatment, and the other succeeding relatively well because
Oh, okay.
they were more resilient. That particular child let it roll off their backs, and the other child took it to heart. And so what we do is, without awareness, we come to those conclusions about ourselves. Well, I ought to be different, I ought to be better, I ought to be, and fill in the blank, but I ought to be other than what I am. Because if I'm other than what I am, my needs will be met.
Yeah, I'll be accepted.
I'll be accepted, I'll be seen, I'll be heard, I'll be valued, I'll be acknowledged. I'll feel better, I'll feel more comfortable. Of course, it doesn't work, because the issue had never been with the child. The issue had always been with the adults. The child is just trying to make sense of the situation the best that they can. But without awareness, what we do is we bring that belief with us into our adult lives. And then what we do, because we're convinced that we just haven't been enough, we have this belief we're not whatever enough. We need to change, we need to be different. So then what we do is we seek out what we call a corrective emotional experience. So, like, we hone in, our unconscious hones in to another adult that we get into an intimate relationship with that reminds us of one or both of our parents. And we try to get, and we
So
try,
that's why we either marry or a relationship with.
men don't marry their moms and women don't marry their dads.
No, no, no.
Oversimplification, yeah.
I'm not saying that that is the what happens 100% of the time, but
Right.
I can myself, I can't obviously speak for anyone else. I know that I have had relationships with people that represented similarities to my parents.
Yes, yes, absolutely. Absolutely. And in order, so that's, and so we believe, well, that, as that article said, the little child is driving the bus. So
Right.
the little child is desperate to get it right. So they seek out somebody unconsciously who puts who helps them reconnect with how they felt in dynamic with their parents. They're often incapable of seeing the person right in front of them and really relate to that person that reminds them of their parent or parents that they couldn't ever please, as if they were that parent. So the partner ends up feeling unseen and unheard and unacknowledged. And the person who's doing it ends up feeling disappointed again and can tend to blame their partner now for this discomfort they feel, when the key to it all is to just recognize that there was never anything wrong with you in the first place.
Right. That it started as a child. And
You concluded incorrectly that there was something wrong with you, but there was never anything. You were perfect. You were perfect, and your parents were wounded.
okay, so how do we change this? How do we okay, so I'm now in my 40s, and what are some of the ways that I could work on that inner child and become more knowing of that?
And this may sound pretty, I mean, there are a lot of therapeutic techniques that can be used, all kinds of different therapeutic techniques that can be used for this. But one pretty simple one is visualizing the little boy that you were, and even imagining him going around with you, like when you're driving. Imagine him on the seat next to you. Get to know him, bring him into the fold, acknowledge him in ways that your parents were not able to acknowledge him, and in ways that he always longed to be acknowledged. See him, hear him, let him know you're here, let him know you'll never leave him, let him know you support him and love him. I mean, I've suggested to people that they do this. Some people have gone so far as to get little baby dolls and carry them around with them as representations of that part of themselves that they disowned because they came to believe that part of themselves didn't have any value, because that's what they got from the way their parents interacted with them.
Right. Well, that makes sense. I mean, as people, we tend to be very visual, and we need that touchy feely type of scenario. So I could see how that could be very effective to have
Yeah.
a physical representation of
Yeah.
your inner child.
I've heard people say that it's very, very helpful. Um, Another thing, like if, I mean, in cases where parents were actually actively abusive or neglectful, I've recommended that some of my clients write them a letter, write their parents a letter from the perspective of the inner child, and be as furious as you need to be. A lot of people were never allowed to have a no as children. They were never allowed to have certain emotions because those emotions made their parents uncomfortable. Typically, it's anger or sadness. You're not sad. Well, I'll give you something to cry. You know, that it's
Yeah.
really diminished. So and the idea is not really to have the individual's parents read those letters, but for the first time, for that child inside to feel like they're being allowed their voice.
No, I definitely understand that because we I know I do it. I'll bite my tongue, I call it. So instead of voicing what I'm thinking and feeling about a specific topic or idea, I would hold it inside. And holding it inside, it just, you draw those like we talk about a lot, you draw those narratives based on holding that information in. So I
Okay.
could definitely see how writing a letter, you're putting it out there. That's why I try to journal as often as I can and write down my ideas so that I'm getting it out.
Well, not only you're getting it out, but one part of you that may have been diminished is having the sense that the grown up part of him is taking him seriously. Maybe that part of you feels taken seriously for the first time in your journaling.
Yes, and then relating that to the thought of confidence. Confidence is such a driving factor. I know in my life and what I do and how I go about my daily routines and job is through confidence.
So how do you achieve confidence? What gives you confidence?
Uh, Honestly, I feel more confident. I have thoughts of confidence more when I speak. So if I keep it inside, if I'm quiet, then I'm not confident in what I'm doing or teaching. But when I'm in an environment where I have people around me and we're discussing topics that are close to what I do on a daily basis, well, that's where the confidence comes from. Just verbalization of it and letting it go, and honestly, having people there listening and involved in the conversation adds to that confidence because I feel like the words that I'm saying have value.
Well, but here's the interesting thing, the direction goes from inside you out to those people. That sense of you knowing you have value gets communicated to those people and it gets bounced back to you. But it starts with you. And so I wanted to ask you, you talk about you bite your tongue. Who gave you that advice when you were young? Who told you to
My
bite your tongue?
parents, my parents,
They
but
said,
not telling me to bite my tongue, just hearing them use that term.
so tell me more. Tell me more about that. What did you hear them say?
Well, there's a time and a place to discuss certain things. I grew up in a you know an Italian Northeast family where you know you're everything stays within the household. Any concerns is not the concerns of the neighbors or the aunts and the uncles and the nieces and the nephews and the cousins. We keep it here. We resolve our issues within us.
And tell me something. How did you feel that those issues were resolved? Did you feel that they were ever actually resolved?
No, absolutely not. And definitely just kind of, just swept under the rug and
Ignore it and it'll go.
exactly, it'll go away.
Bite your
Hmm.
tongue. But the thing about sweeping dirt under the carpet or anything under the carpet is eventually the bump of all that shit swept under the
You
carpet.
trip over it.
You trip over it and fall flat on your face.
Absolutely.
So
Absolutely.
let me ask you something. I don't know that I think I know the answer to this, but
Okay.
neither were one of both of your parents drinkers?
Well, not drinkers. I mean, my mother never, maybe an occasional glass of wine. My father drank more than my mother. He was a roofer, so there were times that, um, but I was very young, and then he was diagnosed with diabetes when I was a teenager,
Right.
and
Stop drinking.
drinking stopped.
Yeah, but when you were very young, Bill, is when
I
you were,
know when you're molded,
and so, you know,
influenced.
but the reason I ask you that question is it's my experience that families that are enmeshed like that, that's a quality often that alcoholic families demand. They
Oh,
demand
okay.
secrets. They're very secretive.
Well,
Often,
that makes sense.
often
I'm
they
sorry.
live, often they live in houses where windows, the shades are drawn, windows are rarely opened.
Oh no,
In,
that wasn't my
in
household.
extreme cases,
Correct.
but generally speaking, there's an addiction that is reflected in families who want to keep everything that they do private. They don't nothing is anybody else's business.
Well, I know that my grandmother, who 98 next month, I believe, and she came over with her 9 brothers and sisters and her mother and father from Italy, and I don't know much about my great grandfather. I know that my grandfather, her husband, was an alcoholic and abusive,
And whose
and
parents are those?
that's my mother's parents.
Your mother's parents. All right.
Correct. And I know that she left him and she went on her own with my aunt was very young at the time, and started a whole new career in her 40s, 50s, as became a nurse. So she was a single mother in what, the 60s and 70s, um, and went and took on a whole new career at a time when that really wasn't heard of.
Was your mom
And
alive at that time though? Did she grow up with an alcoholic dad?
yes, my mother was already, all my mother and her one younger brother and older sister, they were already adults and on their own at this time.
So go figure she marries a guy who drinks.
Who, my mother?
Yeah.
Yeah, well, I mean,
Corrective
yeah.
emotional experience. Let me see if I can get it right. Daddy left me. Daddy liked alcohol more than he liked me, more than he liked mommy. Let me see if I can get it right this time, because it must somehow or other, irrationally, this must have been my fault.
Yeah, but it's amazing because, like I said, we've said this in other episodes that we live in a world now where we can discuss this and actually see how it came about. But at their time of
Didn't get to,
growing up,
yeah.
it wasn't discussed. You didn't, you know, my father went off to Vietnam and then came back, and that's when they decided to get married, and it was just a different time.
Yeah.
And you didn't discuss these things, is what I'm
Yeah.
getting at.
Yeah.
And they
Uh,
still don't. My
no,
mother doesn't openly discuss her
right.
feelings.
Right. So the message there is there's something uncomfortable and to be avoided about feelings.
Yes.
And you have such deep feelings, so you must have almost felt like an imposter in that family. You must have, I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if you felt like there was something really radically wrong with you,
Well,
because you have these feelings. And
yeah, and I mean, I don't know. Here, bite my tongue. I always wear my heart on my sleeve, is the saying that I grew up with, because
that's
that's my
you were told,
personality.
that's what you were told about yourself. But so implicit in that is some sort of judgment, right?
Well, yeah, I definitely feel that, or think, see, I'm getting better. I definitely think that what we say and hear, even with me and my children, and how I say and what I say affects them. You don't realize sometimes, what is hindsight is 2020. You don't realize until after the words have left your lips, and you can't take it back,
But that's okay,
you know.
because I said to you before, it's our duty as parents to mess with kids.
Correct. And
Because
that's what I want to make sure that we understand too, though, is because, I mean, I didn't grow up in an abusive. I'm definitely different than my sister. We have totally different ways of going about things, and um, but I
so are
definitely
you?
feel that there's a lot more openness too between. It's interesting because I'm on the other side of the country, and I've been here for years. I haven't really, with the exception of a couple stops in New Jersey and Philadelphia, I haven't lived near my family for 20 years.
So
So,
am I hearing you defend your parents a little bit?
well, of course. I mean, they're my
Why?
parents.
Why? Nobody's putting your parents on trial.
No, no, no. I understand that.
I,
I just,
hep, 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 hep. Slow down. This is a sensitive place for you. A lot of people feel very defensive of their parents. But these kinds of conversations are not to criticize or judge our parents, because it's a given that our parents did the best that they could.
right.
The purpose of these conversations is to explore the impact that their wounds had on us as children. And that,
Correct.
to go back to the inner child thing, they don't have to be defended. You're not being disloyal. You're just allowing yourself to be honest. You're just allowing yourself to not bite your tongue for fear of hurting someone's feelings. You are taking care of your own feelings, and you're admitting what your feelings always have been, not with a view to judge them, but with a view to let that little part of you finally feel heard and seen and acknowledged. That's a huge difference.
No, I understand that.
So it's not, there's no need to try. I mean, if you admit how you were impacted as a child, it doesn't mean you're being critical of your parents.
No, it's just like admitting what my how I'm impacted in a relationship with my spouse.
And it's your reaction. It's the impact that that has on you. And it isn't a judgment about your spouse at
Right.
all. It's a statement about yourself, and giving yourself permission to look that closely at yourself and acknowledge the effect that what's going on for you. And that is honoring the inner child, in the truest sense of the word, connecting with how that part of you was was had to distort himself, wearing your heart on your sleeve, that's a judgment. That's not a positive. I mean, did you hear that in admiring terms, or did you hear that in kind of critical terms?
Well, at the time, I don't think I thought of it either way because I didn't know to think of it either way.
How did it feel to you when they said that about you?
That I was emotional.
And how did you feel about yourself being defined as emotional when you lived in a household where people weren't?
Oh, just different.
How did it feel for you to be different? Feel different in your family group?
I don't necessarily know if it was a feeling of
Didn't bother you to feel different?
yeah, not that I can recall
Okay.
that it necessarily stuck in as a bother. I actually do remember thinking at a point where, well, wow, I that means that I can understand that. But this was later on, right?
Oh, yeah, yeah, yeah.
So like after because the last time that was really discussed was at my sister's wedding because I had already been in the military for a couple years and I came back from Texas for my sister's wedding and it was emotional because I hadn't seen my sister and everybody for a while and then to be her at her wedding. I mean, so it was brought up there that Billy always wears his heart on his sleeve. That everybody always knows where I'm coming from, feeling wise, how I feel, right?
Yeah.
Emotional. So, but I didn't really look at that until later on, and I was like, you know what? That might not be what they intended, but I was like, I kind of like that.
Well, here's the thing. You were an adult already, first of all. Second of all, people don't really intend much. People speak pretty much automatically without
Right,
thinking.
without thinking.
They often, and especially parents to their children, they're not terribly heartful or mindful about what they're saying. They simply kind of press play on the
Yeah,
tape recorder or the CD player, and the shit that was said to them just comes out of their mouth. Because that's how I was raised, and that's what
right.
was me. And it isn't even that conscious. It's just what you do. It's automatic. Unless people deliberately, first of all, pay sufficient attention to themselves and heal their own inner child so that they can then pay that kind of careful and mindful attention to their actual children. And even then, they're going to screw up.
Well, yeah, because I have ever since we've met, I have paid better attention to what I say, how I react with situations with the kids, just because trying to grow myself and help them as much as I can, because obviously whatever the situation is, whether good or bad, or painful or non-painful, they're going through it, and I don't want to be an addition to.
So
I
you
just
don't
want to be there.
you don't want to add to their difficulties.
Correct. I just want to be there
Mm-hmm.
because I think that just being present is a bigger gift than being vocal.
In no doubt about it. Absolutely 100%. Just being present. So, and the degree to which you can be present to yourself will determine precisely the degree to which you can be present to your children. You
Well,
can't
that's one,
be more present to them than you can be present to yourself.
and that's one of the reasons why I did start journaling and writing down
Mm-hmm.
uh, uh, my daily thoughts and feelings,
Mm-hmm.
because the only way I could learn about what specific situations or how, just like you just asked me, how did it make me feel? What reaction did I have when wear your heart on your sleeve?
Right for you. Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, I cannot recall because I may look very young, but that was a lot of years ago. And but if I had it written down, then I would know, right? So
Yeah.
I tend to focus on that a lot more. Even with work, I don't consider it to be work because it's what I enjoy and love. But I I make a conscious effort to document what conversations I've had, what reactions, what physical, so facial expressions, body language, things like that, did I feel or experience from the other person or the other people.
Let me ask you a question. When you notice a person's reaction to you, like you say facial
Yeah.
expression, body language, do you ever check it out with them?
Stop and ask them.
Yeah,
Oh
looks
yeah,
to me,
definitely. I just did it with our exchange student.
okay, looks to me like you're a little confused about what I just said.
Yeah,
Am I?
absolutely.
Yeah, because that's important. Because otherwise, what we can tend to do is project what's going on in us
On to
on
someone
the
else.
other person. We can assume that we know what's going on in them.
Right, because I really want to understand what they're thinking,
Hmm.
what emotions are
Hmm.
being felt at the time,
Hmm.
especially because one of the major things I thoroughly enjoy, and this is why, like, I think I discussed with you a little bit about going and finishing my degree in psychology and then going further, is because I'm fascinated with what makes what 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 flips that switch in choice, right? What drives decisions within us, and how do we come to these decisions? And it just fascinates me. Um, what influences it? Is it smells, thoughts, you know, sounds? What do people say? Does
I,
that influence?
I think yes to all of the above, but I think it depends on each individual. What influences them? I don't think you can make an across the board statement.
No, I agree with you. I don't think that there's a blanket statement for anything. I think that every situation is different. Now, how do you decipher the situations, right? Or how do you decipher the different people and how they're reacting to things? So,
Well,
all that stuff.
I don't know what you mean by that.
Okay, so like you stated that, uh, you know, what would convince you to make a decision will be different than what would convince someone else, correct? Because you're
Yeah.
two different people.
Yeah, the way I decide on things is different than the way you would decide on things. Your
Correct.
inner
But
criteria are different.
correct. But there has to be signs or tells or something that you know okay, so I always talk about products, right? So when you're talking, so safety might be something that you're interested in, and say your husband, your spouse, your significant other is interested in performance. We'll talk about a vehicle for a minute. Okay, so I'm going to know that safety is important to you by the way you react to when I talk about the safety
You'll get cues that
features.
you'll get
Correct.
cues,
And
yeah.
those are the things that, learning about people's cues and body language and understanding, it fascinates me.
Well, that's why I've said over and over again what would be really appropriate for you to study in more depth is neurolinguistic programming, because that's what they do.
Right.
They know if a person is auditory, visual, kinesthetic, whatever, by where their eyes go if you ask them a question.
Yeah, it's fascinating, isn't it?
If their eyes go up and to the right, it says one thing about their main form of communicating and being. They go up and to the left. If they go down into the left, down into the right, or it's they went really into a lot of depth in developing this way of working with people, and it is pretty damn accurate.
That's what I mean. It's just, see,
You'd
that
love
stuff
NLP.
fascinates me.
You'd love NLP. You would really love NLP.
So
Yes.
I think we're cutting it close here for you.
Uh-oh. Yeah, we are.
See, we went off. We actually stayed really close to topic this whole
That's
episode.
pretty impressive. I'm
Wow, we're getting really good. It only
we're
took us
getting
30 episodes.
really 30 episodes, right?
Yeah.
So next week, we're going to
Yes.
have my friend who is visiting from Connecticut. She's an author, and she wrote a book called The Five Rules for Stress-Free Living.
See, I'm on there. I'm on board.
And she's a lot of fun, and she's very articulate, and it should be hopefully it'll be very interesting for people to hear. So tune in.
Absolutely. Yes, and I'll definitely have after this episode, we'll post her little introduction so people can get a little piece of her
Yeah,
beforehand.
excellent.
So thank you so much, Gina. Again, another great episode.
Yeah.
Very enlightening. I definitely and thoroughly enjoy. And we'll
I
keep
mean,
going.
there's so much that can be said about the inner child, but I think hopefully we did it justice today.
Yes, and like you said, we'll have that article
Yeah.
linked
Oh,
in
yeah.
the show notes,
Yeah, that'd be
so you
great.
can read for yourself. And
Yeah.
yeah, well, thank you, everyone. Thank you, Gina.
My pleasure. Thank you, Bill.
I'll see you next week.
Yep.